We are starting with Carla Aramouny, who is from the Department of Architecture and Design at the American University of Beirut. Carla, yes, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Okay, hi everyone. So I'm actually going to be presenting research that I recently have been doing regarding a public space in my city, Beirut. So this 1970s iconic image of Martyr Square in Beirut remains engraved in many people's and locals' minds. A central city space and collective common, Martyr Square was violently destroyed after years of civil war and an effacing reconstruction process that completely disfigured this iconic center. Left to the vestiges of memory, the square is now only recognizable as a road junction. As a local who never knew the square when it resembled this iconic image, I've always been deeply affected by the violent and forced disappearance of this once vibrant urban node, and by the spatial loss suffered by all Beirutis, especially of older generation, who can never recover the space that they once lived. At the same time, I was equally intrigued by the persisting capacity of the square to retain a symbolic value for the Lebanese and to become, at every charged political or social event, the main collective space that draws millions to its center. The deliberate erasure of the square after the end of the Civil War turned it into a high-profit real estate space and privileged private high-end housing programs over the square's public history and cultural history. With recent socio-political transformation in Lebanon, the square once again became the center of manifestations against the corrupt political system and was reclaimed by the people as a collective ground and a free space open to appropriation. So the square actually is located quite in the center of Beirut, right at the east of what used to be the historic old city center, and not so far actually also from the Beirut port, where in 2020, of course, there was this huge blast in its silos. And so it was, of course, affected like everywhere else in the city with the immensity of the blast. And unfortunately today, we are facing yet again another event of erasure of memory, with the government planning to demolish the silos and to somehow use this demolition to completely efface their guilt and to transform the site into, again, another tabula rasa, another potentially high-end development. And so these aspects of deliberate political erasure and the square's lost urban memory, and as well as its persistent ability to constitute a collective ground, instigated the investigative research that I pursued as an act of resistance and with the aim to understand, reconstruct, and narrate this rich urban node. Part of my interest was to create the missing archive of its urban form and evolution through time, and to catalog its events, particularly its ground level spaces and programmatic permutations that shaped it as a collective sphere and node. The project was presented in 2021 as part of an installation called Beirut Shifting Grounds at the 2021 Venice Biennale, part of its co-habitat section that involved research from different institutions. And my contribution within the team actually was specifically on the temporal lens through the study of this square. So using drawing as an investigative tool for spatial reconstruction and morphological understanding, the work delves into restructuring a 180-year timeline of effaced history, reforming its buildings, infrastructure, and landscape. Here, drawing, and particularly the axonometric, is foregrounded as an investigative practice and as a construct for a time-based narrative. Drawing from an extensive collection of archival records of maps, photographs, and scholarly writings with the support of local experts and archives, the work dissects through drawing the square's urban form and its historical evolution by an applied method of observation, overlays, cross-comparison, mappings, and mostly 3D modeling. So through the work, I actually started by mapping a timeline of the different events in order to understand the changing political and social factors that were part of the evolution of the square, and the repercussions, of course, on its growth and its evolution from an open space into a structured urban node. Interestingly enough, one of the main factors or characteristics of the square was not only having it always be central in the life of Beirutis, but also its continuously changing name that is attributed at each time and at each period to main significant events. So from Place des Canons in the 1700s, later to becoming what is more commonly known as Martyr Square, the Burj Square, Freedom Square much later in time, to now its more Arabic name of the Al-Saha, which means the square. So in its 180 years of transformation history, the square metamorphosed from a Midan, an open field utilized as an extramural meeting node and marketplace, to a structured urban node with a central lush park as the center of the city's Ottoman urban development. It further continued to be a central urban development node with the French Mandate, and later with the establishment of the Lebanese Republic, turning it into a cultural, transportation, and touristic hub, bustling with hotels, theaters, and cinemas. The square's centrality as a unifying ground between different groups living in the city perpetuated its eventual demise, turning it into the hard line of conflict and destroying radically its built fabric. What followed the end of the Civil War was a deliberate erasure of these remaining structures. Whatever was left standing by the Civil War was completely destroyed during the reconstruction process, leading it to its current state as an open road junction, which, however, that gives it or designates it as an open free space that is continuously reclaimed, reappropriated, and reimagined by the people. So, I mean, one of the interesting things for me to construct an archive in a place that is not really, does not really have a proper record or database of city content was how to kind of find all the information about the city, about its buildings, about these different time periods, and obviously starting from several scholarly texts and some reference map. But one of the main things that I delved into was creating an archive or a record of all sorts of photos that I can find online, and trying then through using buildings as landmarks to situate and understand at what time period was this image actually from. And so to catalog them in a way where then I can use that record in order to rebuild the square. Similarly, I worked with several research institutions in Lebanon, looking at the rare records of photographs in order also to understand the events that happened and shaped the area. So the work was done through overlaying a series of old maps and current maps, referring to old photographs of what used to be the space outside the walls of the old city, and trying to also reconstruct images that I can find. These are two images that usually are found separately online, to understand actually how the city behaved and how it actually looked like. And relying additionally on a series of paintings, postcards, all in an attempt really to understand the history in a, let's say, much more rigorous and timely manner. The different maps that existed in the city were a challenge because many of them were drawn by hand early on in like the 1920s. And there was only like a main record that I was able to find from the 1930s, drawn by, during the French Mandate by French surveyors. So that was one of the main records that had a certain precision that I was able to start from, and also verifying through aerial photographs of different time periods, to overlay it with current CAD maps of the city. And so these two years, the 1930s and today, were the reference starting points, the baselines from which then all the other periods were drawn, including the overlay of the old intramural city, which is actually more on the left. And the element that you see hatched completely in solid orange is one of the only buildings that remained after the war, so it's the only recognizable element that I can build from. So during the Biennale, the work was presented as a video sequence that combined the mappings in plan that were redrawn completely in canned and then presented through a timeline and a series of rare photographs. So all the photographs that were presented were ones that were selected from local archives. And through this timeline, each time period reflected on, again using axonometry, reflected on what that space around the square included. So we tried to highlight actually different elements, whether it is, they're very small, whether it is the cars of the time, the transformation modes of the time, methods of utilizing the public space, and the different activities that were happening around, trying to highlight them and record them through these drawings. And then, more importantly, leading until 2019, where the main manifestations had happened and completely took over the square as a very interesting moment I found in time, where it was able to recapture its initial symbolism and presence and to become once again a place of reclamation for the city, here with an additional attempt actually to pinpoint the different types of appropriations that happened within the public square. So the work actually is still continuous. What was presented in the Biennale was sort of this recording of data, the reconstruction of the physical history, the development of the detailed 3D modeling, and then turning them into this narrated sequence. But it's still a work under development. I'm interested in the next steps of understanding somehow more typological and morphological transformations in specific areas, whether it is the center of the square itself, which used to be the park and currently is simply a parking area, to understand how this evolution has happened in more detail, but to also understand around certain building blocks, the development, again, that has occurred, and how at each time period the use of the public ground and the ground space of these different structures had changed and evolved in relationship to political events and social events that were happening at the time. This is the next challenge, because there are no, almost very rare to find images of the actual buildings on the interior or the activities that were there. But as a next step, I'm quite interested in trying to reconstruct these internal spaces and maybe possibly even to imagine and propose what could have happened at that space there. So in conclusion, actually, as an act of reconstructing memory through drawing, the main objective is to formalize this disappeared history in negation of its single iconic image, and as an attempt to inject a deeper evolutionary understanding of the square. The use of drawing is highlighted in this work as a tool of recording and reconstructing, able to transmit with a juxtaposition of archival and photographic artifacts the square's temporality and shifting symbolism in time, its varying functions and activities that help shape it as a national symbol, and ultimately its voiding as a road junction that is still, however, open to spatial reclamation. Thank you, that's it.
Thank you very much, that was fascinating. What I'm going to ask you was sort of partly triggered when you were talking. I was thinking of some of the photographs of Beirut after the war, with these extraordinary concrete frames that had been shot at so much they were between sort of geology and architecture or something, and were sort of simultaneously horrific and wondrous at the same time. And I realize that that's not probably something that you want to discuss or even think about, but it made me think about the character of the architecture, and for instance the reconstruction of, say, the square in Münster in Germany after the war, where there was an attempt to reconstruct the square, the buildings around the square as they had been before the war, but somehow cleaned up and straightened and so on. Mm-hmm. And in your drawings, the scale that they're drawn, and obviously very carefully, they have that sort of appearance of a sort of idealized version of the building. And just thinking of Carol's drawing, for instance, there's a brick arch in that drawing that is on the one hand, and wall that is on the one hand distinctly Roman, but could not be any other arch other than that particular arch, with the sort of care and precision and fascination in which it's drawn. And this is not an attempt to criticize what you're doing or something, but it made me wonder about what it was that would need to be drawn about these buildings beyond their sort of general formal presence or something.
I'm wondering if I can. Oops, sorry. I mean, one of the. Okay, this will continue moving. I'm sorry, but I wish I can pinpoint to at least the one from the Civil War. But you know, as Lebanese living with somehow this guilt of the war, but sort of this stigma of the social amnesia that happened immediately after. People don't want to remember what happened, and somehow the reconstruction process built on that to completely efface and then ultimately rebuild in something that doesn't resemble the city at all. This is part of the psyche, and for us, even current buildings that still exist that have scars of the war, we don't even see them anymore. They're not part of our, let's say, visual memory.
Sorry, I wasn't suggesting that was the important. That was just what made me think about what is it about what you draw, not
Yeah.
the war, but when you're drawing these buildings, what is it about them that really matters, that we should really register about why they matter or something?
Right. I mean, I think partly my own interest was simply to understand the square in its built form, beyond just the single, as I said, the single one moment that somehow is the only thing that people still remember today. When you say Martyr Square, this image of the square and the postcard is the one that appears to mind. Yet the history that the square went to in all its period in relationship to its urban morphology, so whether it was the buildings that were Ottoman in nature, whether it was the certain programs that were there at one point, whether it's the Khan or it's the cafes that were there, those are elements that had situated it to what it was. So I wanted first and foremost to archive those, to record them, to set them, to say, okay, this was here, this was there, and let's say in a bit more didactic first exercise. But I don't really see this work as stopping there. There's a level of reflection that needs to happen to kind of take it to the level of what you're suggesting, to actually understand, okay, what is really being learned from such a process? What is the value of understanding these different build forms? I'm seeing it as a typological study, as somehow understanding how existing structures that were there at certain time periods had built upon pre-existing infrastructures or pre-existing even foundations that somehow evolved and metamorphosed into what they were. They were not like distinct ruptures of time, but very natural, organic processes of development. So this is how I see maybe the value of the work, understanding it more as an urban metamorphosis.
Question or observation. I'm wondering about the orange bits in the drawing, and when you draw a public square, it's quite difficult to draw both the human interaction part or the natural part with the building that frames it. And you're talking about like maybe drawing the interior of buildings, but I'm wondering if you're drawing from photograph. Are you drawing specific event on a specific day? Is there a care of the occupation of the square, or is it the same care between the occupation of the square that is given to the building as well?
It's not I mean, not all time periods are related to a specific day. Actually, it's only like really 2019, because in 2019, the occupation of the square took several months. It wasn't even a single day, but rather a whole time period. But the orange bits are highlighted obviously intentionally and referencing different photographs that highlighted uses of like different modes of transportation at the time, the landscape that was there, the type of trees that was there, and trying maybe to show the persistence of some of these species even, and then like the next development. So, I mean, you can see, for example, with the landscape, you can see some of the trees even remaining until the war. Of course, now they've all been taken out, but these existing trees that were outside the city wall somehow formed this central space that was replanted additionally, and then stayed in the center of the square as the French planted these palm trees that weren't actually local at the time. So there is there is this care that was taken, but it is not explicitly narrated, at least not yet. It's part of the archive, and this is why I'm saying, for me, there's a definite next step that needs to extract all of this in a much more detailed manner.
Very quick. Thank you for the really interesting presentation. Just a little bit of a follow-up on Nat's question. I wondered, there's a preservation, there's an attitude, I'm interested in the work a lot, but there's a preservation of typology in terms of what the discipline has understood that to be. And it may be that it increases the import of architecture relative to your reading and reconstruction, reconsideration of the city, when in fact probably there were things to do with legislation, to do with event constructions and so on, which belong to typological discussions but are normally excluded from them. They're normally to do with program and formations, geometry, and so on. And I just wondered just the early assumptions about what your working palette might be. I think Nat was alluding to this through what you would draw through buildings, but there would be other things like legislation, for example, alone. Policy would have had a big seat at the table in many cases here in terms of the things that you're trying to consider or uncover or reframe. So I just want, I'm interested in that because of drawing's agency and your interests, and the drawing techniques seem to reinforce the typological considerations that come from mapping primarily. And I wonder if there would just be other, as you move through the work, the important work, I think if there would be other right, the graffiti.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, essentially, of course, the development of the square happened through main planning, let's say, urban planning directives with key moments that had articulated that, a lot of which actually then organically somehow got dissipated. But I think I'm more interested currently in how the next step for the square might be. So our experience recently with structured top-down planning is that it somehow, it always approaches the city as a purely real estate project. So I'm much more interested actually in how we can learn from the informal practices. So these two end time periods, the square as a free space in the 1800s, before it was structured and planned from Ottoman to the Republic and whatnot. And then today, where it's yet again in this open state, how we can learn from these two moments to actually influence next urban developments, because what is there now completely is disconnected from people and the ground level. So in the hopes that that can generate new forms of interventions, installations, architectures, that might relate more to people and an active ground space. But I mean, absolutely, in order to understand that, even with a certain typology, I think it's completely essential to understand what actually led to this transformation, period after period.
Thank Carla, I'm behind the drawings, but speaking for Carol, besides the fact that Robert Saliba would be very pleased with your work, and then she adds a smiley face, I'm amazed by this project. I know how it is difficult to find and gather archival documents in Lebanon. Since Martyr Square is a site recurrent in architecture schools or other speculative projects, do you think that this documentation will perhaps help in finding some kind of an agreement, hard to think possible, in Beirut, as to how to protect this site from potential and aggressive speculation?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, we're struggling in Beirut to control anything that's happening from the area of the port to Martyr Square. I don't know if I mean, I think it's an important record that can be a good reference for people, students of architecture, other faculty that are studying the square. It is a base that they can at least start from. It's a data set that's in CAD and in 3D Rhino mostly that can be used actually to evolve next maybe more critical research that could happen. And yes, Carol, I think Robert will be very pleased with this, but I'm not very hopeful that it can affect anything at this point at a legislative manner, but maybe if we do have a real upheaval of our current political system, maybe then there might be some hope.
Great, thank you, Carla.
Thank you.